Hey, it's a little after 3 o'clock and it's pretty quiet around here, so Spatial Shark figured I would try to bang out one more quick video before I head off to the land where it's 13 degrees, Indianapolis, Indiana. So let's talk about some boundaries and some borders and some barriers. This is the subject of the S3 Geo inquiry that we'll do next week when I get back. Even though GIS Day is tomorrow, we'll celebrate a little bit belatedly. But essentially, watch this little section of the slideshow very carefully because this will have a lot to do with the work that we do next week. So what is a boundary? A boundary is a vertical plane. It actually cuts into the subsoil because we got resources down there, and it nowadays goes up into the airspace above. And really increasingly, countries are starting to worry about what about even into outer space? You know, when states have space programs that can launch satellites and can spy on each other and take pictures from, miles and miles up into the atmosphere, where does that boundary actually go to? And again, it is a vertical plane. Frontier, not so precise. That's going to be more of a zone of separation. We always talk about the frontier between the United States and Mexico back in the 1800s, where outlaws could rob a bank on the U.S. side and run across the border to the Mexican side. Nowadays, with extradition agreements and treaties between countries, that kind of flight, I should say, from justice is usually not as effective. We have several different types of boundaries. If they're straight line conforming to latitude, longitude, we call those geometric boundaries. You see a lot of those in Africa because, of course, African boundaries were not drawn by Africans. They were drawn by Europeans. That Berlin Conference of 1884, where a bunch of European states carved up Africa like a cake. We also have a lot of geometric boundaries in the United States, where Congress took areas of the western states where, the physical terrain was flat, and they just said, hey, let's just start drawing these geometric shapes and straight lines. Some of that had to do also with the Homestead Act of 1862, which implemented a rectilinear landscape on the United States. And if you look at the flyover states, they tend to be rectangular, and especially the counties inside of them tend to be rectangular as well. Physical boundaries, they follow natural features, rivers, of course, mountain ranges sometimes. Cultural boundaries will divide the human landscape, the built landscape, by language or by religion or by race or by ethnicity. Boundaries that were there before the cultural landscape was built are sometimes called antecedent. In this case, ante means before, not anti like against, but ante like, antes in Espanol, right? It means that it was before. So if it's after human settlement, we say it's a consequent or a subsequent boundary. And sometimes we have enclaves and exclaves. And certainly you can search these up and you'll see some examples in the work that I'm leaving you. But an enclave is an area that's totally surrounded by territory that belongs to another state. So this is like Lesotho inside South Africa. It's its own state, but it's totally surrounded by South Africa. So they have to have good relationships with the country that surrounds them. An exclave is a piece of territory that is broken off from the majority of the state. And this would be like Alaska or Kaliningrad with Russia that you could search up, or Cabinda with Angola that you could look at. Exclaves are territory that's separate. But you wouldn't say things like Hawaii because obviously that's separated by water, not by land. A lot of times boundaries are put down arbitrarily or forcibly by outsiders. These are the boundaries that you see all over Africa, where white European colonizers came in and said, this is where we're going to split Niger from Nigeria. This is where we're going to split, the Democratic Republic of Congo from what became the Republic of Congo, one being French, one being Belgium. Other boundaries could be relic boundaries. And these are like, again, what relic sometimes means, even in other contexts, is that it's old. And so these are boundaries that are no longer used, like the Berlin Wall that was taken down. Or you could even argue that the Schengen Agreement has made the boundaries of the different states within the EU somewhat of a relic, because no longer do you have the strict border controls and the restrictions on immigration of people moving from one European Union economy into another in order to find work. The Schengen area was deliberately designed to promote the free movement of labor across the EU. So here's just a quick little visual of what I meant by a vertical plane, that the boundary is not just on the land, that it literally goes up into the airspace and down into the subsoil. Boundaries, of course, go through different stages. They have to be defined, they have to be delimited, and sometimes they are actually demarcated. And we'll talk about that. So when you have a definition, that's usually a conference or a treaty. Diplomats get together and they argue over whether the boundaries should be, A or B. In American history, you know that President Polk always, campaigned on this promise of 54-40 or fight. The boundary between the United States and British North America was going to be 54 degrees latitude, 40 minutes, and we were going to go to war if we didn't get 54-40. Well, guess what? We didn't get 54-40. We agreed on 49, and that's where the boundary runs across the United States and Canada today. The British, by the way, wanted that boundary, I think, 44 or 46. So we compromised and we put that line somewhere in the middle. So the definition is the legal description of the boundary. This happens even in your neighborhood with your homeowners association and with your parents. You can ask the title documents to your house. It lays out exactly where the boundary is going to be. That doesn't mean there's a fence there. That doesn't mean that there's ever a question about, if your neighbor's fruit tree drops fruit into your yard or if their leaves fall into your pool. There are always these disputes that can happen, but the definition has to be legally agreed on. Delimitation means we put it on a map or a chart. It's literally the act of drawing the line so that everybody can publish it and see it. Demarcation is a physical boundary, and this is where we talk about not just boundaries and borders, but barriers, erecting a wall, putting up a fence, marking it with stones. All across New England, you'll see that farms are demarcated where one farmer's territory stops and the next begins. They'll build these stone walls, or they'll plant trees to actually physically mark the boundary, and that's demarcation. In world history, you might learn about the papal line of demarcation, where the Pope resolved a dispute between the Spanish and the Portuguese about who owned what in South America in the time of the age of exploration and colonization. And we call it the papal line of demarcation, but that is physically so wrong. The Pope did not go out into the Amazon and erect a wall to split Portuguese Brazil from Spanish, territories in the rest of South America. He simply drew the line on a map. It should be called the papal line of delimitation, not the papal line of demarcation. Definitional disputes concern that legal definition. For example, sometimes countries will say that their border is the river that is between them. But where in the river? Is it the deepest part of the river? Is it one shore or the other shoreline? For example, where I go to read AP exams in Cincinnati, Kentucky and Ohio legally define the border as the Ohio River, but it's the Ohio side of the river that is the boundary. So Kentucky quite literally owns the water of the Ohio River. As soon as you get off the shore of Ohio, you're in Kentucky, in the water. The Thalweg, it's a word you'll probably never hear, but the Thalweg of a river is the deepest part of the river. And this is sometimes important because that can shift, that can change. Sometimes rivers are affected by tidal surges. Sometimes earthquakes shift a river. In the United States, we actually have some boundaries where states can't agree on territory because along the Mississippi River, we had a lot of these oxbow lakes where the earthquakes have happened. There's one that's called Crater Lake in Iowa. It's actually fully inside of Nebraska, but it's a piece of Iowa because there was an earthquake and the Mississippi River moved, and therefore it shifted and it changed the boundary so that it's a different part of that territory. So all of these things are very interesting when you look at that. And by the way, that wasn't the Mississippi River. Sorry, that was the Missouri River, where Omaha has that little neighborhood called Carter Lake. Locational disputes, they say, well, yeah, we know where the boundary is supposed to be, but this is not really where the boundary is. So then they go out and they say, well, this is the spot. And locational disputes can sometimes cause conflict over land as well. Operational disputes. Does the boundary function? And this is something that's happening within the EU because the EU has removed most of their boundaries between the different states. Sometimes people get into a European country and then they find it easier to move about once they get inside the EU. And so this is causing some of the European countries a bit of consternation because they attempt to police the exterior borders of Europe, but they don't do so much of a job of policing the internal boundaries of Europe. And sometimes these are operational boundary disputes. Sometimes the United States is upset with Mexico because not only are we trying to police the border from our side, but we want Mexico to do a better job of policing the boundary from their side. Don't let the refugees, or in this case, immigrants, even get to or approach the border. Sometimes allocational disputes have to do with resources, and this is one of the big issues with Iraq and Kuwait before the first Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein was saying that the Kuwaitis were illegally pumping oil from an oil field that was shared by both Kuwait and by Iraq, and he used that as a pretext for going to war. Superimposed boundaries, we already talked about these. They're put down by outsiders. They have no concern for what the local people may want or need, and this can create some really big problems. All throughout Africa, we see really bad borders that were created by European colonizers who didn't care what the tribal African groups wanted or needed, or what the effects would be 100 years, 200 years later. This can sometimes create landlocked states who do not have access to the ocean. Be careful, don't say that they don't have access to water. Many of them have access to rivers, but they don't have an outlet or a port on the sea. And this can create big economic problems. Africa has more landlocked countries than any other continent in the world. And so when you see conflicts over land, sometimes bad borders are the source of that conflict. Sometimes minority cultures can be wiped out because they get put into a state where they are not the majority. Their language suffers, their identity suffers because they become assimilated into the larger group. Here are some great examples of all kinds of boundaries that we've just been talking about. We have some physical boundaries where the Congo River forms the boundary here. We have some geometric boundaries where we've got some straight lines. We have some boundaries that are antecedent. We have some that are subsequent. We've got some exclaves. This is that little piece of Cabinda that I was telling about that belongs to Angola, but it actually doesn't touch the rest of Angola, so that the Democratic Republic of Congo has an outlet to the ocean. This kind of weird, funky, it's called the Caprivi Strip. Namibia was German Southwest Africa, and they were desperately trying to get access to the Zambezi River so that they would have an outlet over to the east side of Africa into the Indian Ocean. So the Germans at that Berlin conference, they demanded that instead of this border going straight up and cutting off access to the river, they demanded that their colonial possession, which later became the independent country of Namibia when it broke away from South Africa in the 80s, they demanded that their little colony would have access to that Zambezi River. You've got your enclaves here, like Lesotho, completely and totally surrounded by territory that belongs to South Africa. Swaziland, not an enclave because it's not totally surrounded. It's bordered by both South Africa and Mozambique. Neither is it an exclave because it's not a piece of something else, where Cabinda definitely is a piece of Angola. It's not an enclave because it's not totally surrounded. So you can be an enclave or you can be an exclave or you could be both, just depending on the situation. We have some microstates in Africa that are super small, like Rwanda and Burundi. We definitely have some cultural boundaries. As I mentioned, Mozambique and Angola were both Portuguese by colonization, whereas Somalia was mostly Italian. A lot of English-speaking, a lot of French-speaking countries, and even some German-speaking countries as well in terms of colonial history. Notice the railroads. Everything in Africa was designed to go out. This is one of the big economic handicaps that Africa still has today. African infrastructure was not built for making Africa richer. African infrastructure was built to make Europeans richer. So when we think about barriers, there was a question on the 22 AP exam about walls and why they're built. So we'll go real quickly through this. And I've told you the funny story. The number one answer for walls in the modern day was kids told us about the Great Wall of China. I'm sorry, Mulan, but that's 2,000 years old. But the DMZ between the two Koreas, the security fence that marks Israeli and Palestinian territory throughout Jerusalem and other areas of Israel. Certainly the wall that we have between the United States and Mexico. Mexico. All of these are great examples of modern day walls, and certainly the Berlin Wall that's no longer there. But why do we build walls? So take a look at through this. We're coming up on 15 minutes, so I don't necessarily want to read this to you. But certainly you can think about what's the purpose of the wall, how expensive are the walls, as we know in our country currently with the big political debate about how we will improve the wall between the United States and Mexico. We've had a border fence for quite a long time. Is it completely efficacious? And really, would any wall be efficacious? Because as soon as you build a wall, what are some people going to say? Oh, I want to get over that or under that or through that or around that. You know, you by putting the wall there, you're almost challenging people to try and get in. All right, so that'll be a great place for us to stop. We'll talk about walls such as the Great Wall of China historically, and then again the modern day walls. I'll show you that essay about barriers and borders and boundaries. And this is the wall that I was mentioning between Palestinian and Israeli neighborhoods. Israeli neighborhood here in the foreground, Palestinian neighborhood in the background there, and there you can see the wall. We had peace walls in Northern Ireland between Protestant and Catholic neighborhoods. So again, walls are something that we see all over the world, and every rich country, generally speaking, tries to limit immigration from poorer parts of the world. Here's another place where boundaries are sometimes difficult, and this is when you get out into what they call the empty quarter, the physically barren parts of the Arabian Peninsula, where the boundary is pretty much still undefined. The two sides disagree over where that boundary should be. And of course, Yemen right now is a pretty big failed state problem where there's a massive war going on between Yemeni factions, and one of those factions is very much against Saudi Arabia and launching rockets into Saudi Arabia and targeting Saudi infrastructure. So this is a great example of how border conflicts can sometimes happen. But again, what are we fighting about? We're fighting about land, and especially when there are resources underneath that land. So that's where we'll stop. We'll come back with the next video. It might be a while when I get back from Indiana, but we'll talk about UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.